Laboratory for Comparative Social Research, who agreed to give us an honorary report titled as Competing Explanations for Electoral Choices. And our format is as follows, that Hans-Peter will have about 50 minutes for his talk, and then we will have about 40 minutes for Q&A. So Hans-Peter, the floor is yours, so please.
Can you see?
Yes, we can see.
I can't see anybody except you. Is that?
Maybe this is because your presentation is on and you only see one person because of that.
Okay. Okay. Then it's maybe not so useful for everybody to keep the camera on. But let me start.
Sorry.
The title is Explaining Electoral Choices of European Voters. So I want to present you a relatively ambitious paper which I wrote together with Chendi Wang and Agirios Altipamakis, who are two of my collaborators. And by way of introduction, Andrei said that competing explanations of electoral choices, yes, there are competing explanations of electoral choices, and I will test three of them: the strategic approach, the group identity approach, and the structural approach, which means that I leave aside others which are also possible. The retrospective voting approach, which is illustrated by economic voting, the rational choice approach of the economists, and the political communication approach of the communication sciences. And there are certainly others which I do not go into. So first, the strategic voting approach. More recently, Katrin de Vries and Sarah Hobelt have written a book about political entrepreneurs, and this is maybe the last word on this approach. This approach emphasizes the strategic use of new or previously ignored issues by challenger parties, which attack mainstream parties and drive a wedge between established coalitions. So this approach stresses the role of political elites, of political entrepreneurs, of the supply side of voting in shaping the vote choices. So voters vote as a function of political mobilization by political entrepreneurs. The group identity approach, which has more recently been promoted by Aiken and Bartels in their book entitled Democracy for Realists, but which goes back to the American voter, the famous study by Campbell, Converse, and others published in 1960. According to this approach, voters choose a party based on their social and political identity. And the most important identity for the voting choice is party identity. So this approach, on the one hand, stresses the demand side, but it is also taking into account the supply side, because it claims that voters rationalize their choice with appropriate party-supplied reasons, including issue-specific positions. That is, the parties shape the issue positions of the voters who identify with them. Now, the structural approach, this is my preferred approach, but this is the approach which goes back to Lipset and Rock, Brocken, their famous paper 1967, and which is also the approach of Bartolini and Mayer in 1990. According to this approach, party competition is rooted in a limited number of structural conflicts that structure the vote. Based on their structural position, for example, based on their class position or their religion, individuals adopt subjective orientations, values, beliefs, issue-specific attitudes, which are then influenced by parties and expressed in a political behavior that is in a vote choice. The structural approach is somehow situated between the other two. On the one hand, on the supply side, party competition on specific issues is essential, but the structural conflicts set constraints for strategic competition between political entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs cannot pick up any old issue. It's the structural conflicts which determine which issues are relevant. On the other hand, on the demand side, issue positions are ultimately rooted in group identities, but party identity is derivative of social identities and issue-specific attitudes. So I gave you this introduction as a clarification because most of you are not political scientists and you might not be familiar with these approaches. What I will do now, I will discuss the effect of three important sets of variables which are important for all three approaches: the effect of party mobilization, the effect of party identity, and the effect of issue-specific attitudes on the vote. Then I will discuss the design of the study, the results, and conclude. So first about theory, and the first aspect of theory is the issue-specific mobilization by parties. Political issues are important for both the strategic and the structural approach. And the key link, they provide the key link between the demand side and the supply side of party competition, between the voters and the parties. But the link is conceived in different ways by these two approaches. The strategic approach stresses the salience of the issues. That is, voters prefer parties that appeal to issues which they consider most salient. Subjective issue salience is influenced by the party's strategic mobilization on issues, and especially by the party's mobilization on issues which they own. Now, ownership of issue means that the party has a reputation of competence on these issues. For example, the radical right party has a competence on immigration issues because this is the issue on which it most mobilizes and for which it's most known. On the other hand, the structural approach claims that voters prefer parties that defend issue-specific positions on underlying structural conflicts that are in line with the voters' own positions. So for the ones it's salience, for the others it's position. But both the structural approach and the strategic approach do not claim that party electoral campaign can change attitudes. For the strategic approach, the party mobilization raises the salience of an issue, mostly an issue they own, and therefore increases the vote choice for the party. If immigration is more salient, people will vote for the party that owns the issue. They will vote for the radical right. The structural approach, on the other hand, says parties' mobilization on a given issue reinforce and or activate the effect of the corresponding issue-specific attitudes on the vote, especially for issues the parties own. So according to this approach, party mobilization does not change attitudes either, but it reinforces the effect of a position on a given attitude, for example, anti-immigration positions in the case of the radical right for the vote. So you have the salience hypothesis versus the reinforcement hypothesis. Secondly, party identities, party families, and issue-specific attitudes. Now, the group identity approach says party identity is the unmoved mover of vote choice. On the one hand, it is unmoved because loyalty to the party is learned early in life, and it remains largely unchanged later on. So once you are loyal to the Social Democrats, you are loyal to the Social Democrats throughout your life. On the other hand, the party is also an opinion-forming agency of great importance. Once you identify with the Social Democrats, you will listen to what they say and you will adopt the attitudes of the Social Democrats on different issues. The so-called freezing hypothesis of the structural approach is very similar, although it does never argue with party identities. But the freezing hypothesis claimed in the 60s when Lipset and Rocken formulated it that since the 1920s, party systems had been frozen in Europe, and that was because voters had developed loyalties which were then handed over from one generation to the other, and not only you were a Social Democrat, but also your sons and daughters became Social Democrats forever. And in this view too, parties were organizers of underlying social conflicts and were expressing the attitudes of the voters on social conflicts. Now, this party identity hypothesis was developed for the US two-party system, while the freezing hypothesis referred to Europe's multi-party systems. And since we are talking about Europe, we need to pay attention to the multiple party families that exist in Europe. So you had classic conflicts in Europe, and you had these four classic conflicts of Lipset and Brocken. Religious conflicts, which created Catholic, Protestant, and eventually Christian democratic parties. You had rural-urban conflicts, which created agrarian parties. Then you had center-periphery conflicts, which created regional parties, and class conflicts, which created first liberal and conservatives on what was later on the right, and social democrats and communist parties on the left. And then, of course, as I have claimed in the past, there are new conflicts which have been articulated by new challenger parties. First of all, in the wake of the Cultural Revolution of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, new issues have come up, like issues of cultural liberalism, international solidarity and peace, and the environment, which have mainly been articulated by green parties and radical new left parties. And then there has been resistance to globalization from the 1990s up to the present, which has raised issues of immigration and European integration, and which has mainly contributed to the rise of radical right parties. So with these new conflicts, there has been increasing volatility in the European party systems, and there has been a decline of party identification. In the terminology of Lipset and Rocken, there was a defreezing of party systems. But Bartolini and Mayer early on in 1990 have already shown that the increasing volatility was mainly volatility within the blocks of the left on the one hand and the right on the other hand. That is, between bloc volatility remained rather low, but within the blocks, people changed parties, for example, from the Social Democrats to the Greens. So we concluded from this that in Europe, what is really the most important identity is a bloc identity and not a party identity. And you have a left identity and you have a right identity, which is politically extremely consequential. So which are the party families we should distinguish now? And in answering this question, we try to reduce the complexity and focus on just 6 party families. On the left, we have the mainstream parties, the Social Democrats, and we have the challengers, which are the radical left and the Greens. And on the right, we have 2 mainstream parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, Christian Democrats, and 1 challenger party, the radical right. Now, we take together the Conservatives and the Christian Democrats because in most party systems, they don't coexist. There is either the one or the other. Only in Scandinavia, you have both of them. So for the rest, I will talk just about conservatives. This is the conservative family. By focusing on these 6 party families, we reduce complexity because we leave aside regional parties, agrarian parties, special issue parties, and we combine social and conservative liberals as we do on the radical left, combine communist, old traditional communists or democratic socialists on the one hand, and red-green new left parties on the other hand. Now, what are the hypotheses? Parties and identity, we hypothesize, has a greater effect for mainstream parties than for challenger parties. So the challenger parties have come up in a period of defreezing when people did not or no longer develop such close party or bloc identities as in the past. And older generations who have been socialized earlier on, they still identify according to the partisan identity hypothesis, who still identify with the parties, the mainstream parties they have been identified with when they were politically socialized. Issue voting, which is dear to the structural approach, differentiates between competitors within the same bloc, and issue voting is expected to have a greater effect for challenger parties. That is the general issue voting hypothesis. But issue voting depends on the issue owned by the different parties. So there are specific issue voting expectations, and here they are. The mainstream parties are expected to benefit from the vote on economic issues. The mainstream parties are the parties that have been created on the different sides of the class conflict. Liberals and conservatives take inegalitarian positions, and the Social Democrats take egalitarian positions. The challenger parties are expected to benefit from cultural issues, especially the new cultural issues, cultural liberalism and immigration. However, there are exceptions, namely the conservatives. They have also been mobilizing on cultural conflicts, on the traditional cultural religious conflict, and they have been defending conservative positions against cultural liberalism. So we expect them to benefit also from traditional cultural conflicts. And finally, the radical left is not just the new party family, as I mentioned before, but it contains the communist component, which is a classical, old, traditional mainstream party to a certain extent. So we expect the radical left to benefit on economic issues as well. So this concludes the presentation of the theoretical ideas, and we can certainly discuss them in Q&A. Now, the design of the study. The whole exercise depends on the combination of 2 files. We need data from the demand side and we need data from the supply side. From the demand side, we have the cumulative ESS file, which provides us with data for 2002 to 2018. For the supply side, we rely on the so-called COSA file, which has information on party-specific national electoral campaigns. I will come back to that. We have matched information from these two files for 54 elections in 14 countries. There are Northwestern European countries, there are the 4 main Southern European countries, and there are mainly 2 Eastern European countries, Hungary and Poland. For Latvia, we have just 1 election. The dependent variable in our analysis will be the vote choice, dichotomous vote choice indicators, 1 for each party family. And we had to create, we cannot do multinomial logit regressions because the composition of the party system varies from one country to the other. And some countries don't have specific parties. So instead of looking at all the parties together, we look at the party specifically in the countries and elections where they exist. The independent variables at the individual level are partisan identity, and we distinguish between left, right, and non-aligned. That is, we do something very similar to what Julia did yesterday when she had the comparison, the dummy indicators for the comparison between individual and group level self-expression values. For issue voting, we have attitudes on 3 issues. The reduction of income inequalities is issue number 1. It's our economic issue. Gay rights is the traditional cultural issue where conservatives oppose liberals, and immigration is the new cultural issue where nationalists oppose cosmopolitans or multiculturalists. Controls, we have age, gender, education, and an indicator for being left behind. At the aggregate level, as I said, we use this COSA data, and COSA is a content analysis of electoral campaigns in newspapers. 2 newspapers per country, 1 more from the left, 1 more from the right, and we analyze core sentences. That is, we code the newspaper articles sentence by sentence. And what is a core sentence? A core sentence is the reduction of a sentence just to the simple structure of actor-object relations. The actor is a political party. The object is either an issue or another actor, but in this study we only look at how actors, parties are positioned with respect to issues. So we look at the direction between the actor and the issue, which can be positive, neutral, or negative. And our indicator for party mobilization during the campaign on a specific issue is the product of the salience of the issue for the party and the direction the party takes on the issue. So the salience is just the share of all the party statements during the electoral campaign on this issue, and the direction is the distance of the party position on the issue from the mean of all the parties' positions on the issue. That is, it shows how much the party position deviates from the average issue during the campaign, average issue position during the campaign. And we match the 3 issues of the ESS with 3 issues of the COSA dataset for income equality. We use welfare, mobilization on welfare issues. For gay rights, we use mobilization on cultural liberalism. And for immigration, we use mobilization on immigration issues. We estimate multi-level logit regressions. We have 58,000 individuals at the individual level and 54 elections at the upper level. And we estimate this by Bayesian estimation procedures. I could explain why we do so in Q&A. I will present you the results in 3 steps. The first step is issue-specific mobilization. The second is concerned with partisan identity, and the third is concerned with issue voting. Oh, first, the effect of supply-side issue-specific mobilization. Does it affect partisan vote? And the first result is quite a shock for the strategic model, because we could not find direct effects of issue-specific mobilization on the vote, with one exception, and that exception is unexpected and does not fit the expectations of the strategic model either. Now, this negative effect, this negative result might have something to do that our data are not optimal for testing the effect of supply-side mobilization on the vote according to the salience model, because we have no information on the subjective perception of issue-specific importance at the individual level. That is, we need to assume a direct effect of partisan mobilization on the vote choice without having information on the mediating effect of subjective perceptions of salience at the individual level. On the other hand, we do find reinforcement effects for issue voting in favor of various party families. And the pattern is quite clear-cut on the right. It's not clear on the left. So what I will show you is the pattern on the right. And this graph shows you the results for the Liberal parties and the Conservative parties. And you see for each party 3 graphs, one for immigration, one for gay rights, and one for income equality. And you see on the horizontal level the mobilization by the party in favor or against these issues. And on the vertical level, you see on the vertical axis, you see the effect of the attitudes at the given level of mobilization. So you see the marginal effect, for example, here for income inequality. You see the marginal effect of the attitude with respect to income equality at different levels of mobilization by the liberals in the upper graph and by the conservatives in the lower graph. And you see that, as expected, the effect of attitudes against income equality is reinforced if these 2 parties mobilize against income equality. So these parties are traditionally liberal in economic terms. They are against income equality, against intervention of the state for income equality. And if they mobilize, the stronger they mobilize in the electoral campaign against income equality, the more the attitude, the individual attitude with respect to income equality has an effect on the vote. Here you see that the liberals and the conservatives differ in cultural terms. The conservatives are against cultural liberalism, and the more they mobilize against cultural liberalism, the more opposition to cultural liberalism will affect the vote for these parties. On the other hand, the liberals are liberal not only in economic but also in cultural terms, and the more they mobilize in favor of gay rights, the more gay rights attitudes will be relevant for the vote for the liberals. So here we see clearly examples of these reinforcing effects. And for the liberals, we see the same also with respect to immigration attitudes. But note that the strongest effect is on the right upper graph for liberal economic attitudes on the vote for the liberals. and in the middle, in the lower row, for conservative cultural attitudes for the conservatives.
Is it okay to ask a clarifying question?
Yes, I can't see anybody.
But this is Edward. Do I understand it correctly that the vertical dimension on these graphs is percent of change, irrespective whether it is the change for the party or changed against?
So no, it's the change in favor of the party. What does it look at on the upper row on the right?
Mm-hmm.
The liberals. The liberals are against economic equality. So
that's right.
If they mobilize against, that's on the left-hand side, the effect becomes ever more negative. That means those who are against equality vote ever more for the liberals.
Well, thank you.
And the same for the conservatives in cultural terms. Those who are against because negative times negative is positive. Those who are against gay rights, they vote ever more for the conservatives. It's what you see is the maximum marginal effect between the two poles of the two pole positions of the respective attitudes.
Okay.
And here you see the same thing for the radical right. This is also a very strong effect. The more the radical right mobilizes against immigration, the more immigration attitudes, anti-immigration attitudes are relevant for the vote for the radical right. So if you are against immigration and the radical right mobilizes strongly against immigration, your attitude has a stronger effect on your vote for the radical right than when it does not so much mobilize. It always mobilizes against immigration, but it can be more or less. Note also that the mobilization of the radical right in terms of cultural liberalism has virtually no effect. And the same is true for the mobilization of the radical right in terms of economic issues. So it's really the immigration which makes a difference. Now, I told you that on the left, the results are not so clear. We would have expected that the Greens and the radical left, they benefit from the new cultural issues. But strangely enough, it's the Social Democrats who benefit from their mobilization in terms of immigration. The more they mobilize in favor of immigration, the more they benefit from pro-immigration attitudes on their vote. All the other effects for the left are insignificant, unfortunately. Now, let us turn to the second set of results, which concern parties and identity. Here we expect stronger effects for mainstream parties than for challenger parties, and that's actually what we find. But the results vary in the details, as you will see right now. You see here 6 graphs again, one for each party family. And what you see here is a bit simpler than before, because you see here the probability, the average probability of voting for the party. And you see it for people who identify with the right, people who identify with the left, and the non-aligned respondents who identify with neither left nor right. And let's look at the Social Democrats. You see that for the people who identify with the left, the chance that they vote for the Social Democrats is more than 50%. People who are non-aligned have about a 30% chance to vote for the Social Democrats, and people who are on the right still have a 10% chance to vote for the Social Democrats. But what is really impressive is the very high probability to vote for the Social Democrats if you are identified with the left. And conversely, the picture is the same for the Christian Democrats. So these two mainstream parties benefit enormously from the identification with the left or the right. For the Christian Democrats and conservatives, you can see if you're on the right, the likelihood that you vote for these parties is even bigger than 0.60. If you are non-aligned, it's again about a third. And if you are on the other side, it's still 10%. This contrasts with the liberals, and this is a result which we did not expect. For the liberals, party identity does not make a big difference. You see it, whether you are on the right or non-aligned, your probability for voting for the liberals is pretty similar. Now, if you take the new challengers, we would have expected that party identity is less important as well, and this is indeed the case if you compare the Greens and the radical right. The Greens benefit much more from left identifiers than from right identifiers, but with respect to the non-aligned, the situation is less clear. And the same applies with respect to the radical right. They benefit much more from the right than from the left. Almost nobody on the left votes for them, but with respect to the non-aligned, it's not so clear. The radical left benefits strongly from party identities on the left. And this is not necessarily what we expected either, because this is a challenger party. But as I said before, this party family has a strong communist component, which has a long tradition with respect to, let's say, bloc identities or party identities. So it is maybe not so surprising that they benefit enormously from identities with the left bloc. Now, finally, issue voting. Here we expected the Social Democrats to benefit from economic issues, the challenger parties to benefit from cultural issues, and the radical left to benefit from economic issues. And all this is confirmed, as you will see in a moment. On the right, we expected liberal and conservatives to benefit from economic issues, the conservatives to benefit from cultural issues, from the culturally conservative vote, and the radical right to benefit from immigration issues, but not necessarily from culturally liberal issues. And to analyze these expectations, you have this graph. In this graph, you have the 6 party families again, and for each party family, you have the 3 issues: the gay rights issue, the immigration issue, and the income inequality issue. And you have for each issue the likelihood of people on the right, on the left, and the non-aligned people to vote for these parties. And let's again start with the Social Democrats and income inequality. You see, people who favor income equality, they have a higher likelihood to vote for the Social Democrats, and that we would have expected because it's an economic issue and they take the progressive position on the economic issue. What we probably did not expect so much is that the Social Democrats benefit more on this issue from the vote of the non-aligned and the right than from voters of their own camp. So that's a bit unexpected. With respect to cultural issues, it's also a bit unexpected that the Social Democrats benefit on the left from people who are culturally conservative, while they benefit, on the other hand, from progressives who identify with the right. And similarly among the non-aligned, although the effect is not so significant. With respect to immigration, they benefit mainly from pro-immigration people, progressive people on the right, while they don't benefit from progressive people of their own camp or the non-aligned. Now, this particular issue-specific voting for the Social Democrats has a lot to do with the fact that they face two oppositions on the left. With respect to the economic issue, they face in particular the opposition of the radical left, which, as you see here, benefits greatly from people, progressive people, in terms of the economic issue on the left. So the economic competition for the Social Democrats on the left comes from the radical left. And the cultural competition for the Social Democrats on the cultural issues comes on the immigration issue, on the new cultural issue, comes mainly from the Greens. And also on cultural liberalism, it comes from the Greens. And on cultural liberalism, it also comes from the radical left. So much for the left. Now for the right. Look at the liberals and the conservatives, the two mainstream parties who both should have benefited from their economic liberal position, both from, or mainly from the right, but maybe also from the non-aligned and even from the left. And this is indeed the case, especially for the liberals. The liberals benefit from their neoliberal positions among the right, but even more so among the non-aligned voters and the left-wing voters. For the Christian Democrats, it's only among the non-aligned and the left-wing voters that they benefit in terms of their economic neoliberalism. Look now with respect to the cultural issues. The Christian Democrats indeed benefit enormously from their culturally conservative positions, mainly on the right and among the non-aligned, but also among left-wing voters. The liberals, on the other hand, they benefit mainly from their progressive positions in cosmopolitan terms on the immigration issue, a little bit also on the cultural liberal issue. And finally, the radical right. The radical right benefits almost exclusively from its position on immigration, and it benefits most from its immigration position on the radical right. It also benefits a little bit from its immigration position on the left. Even on the left, if somebody on the left is against immigration, he has a likelihood of about 10% to vote for the radical right, and the non-aligned have a likelihood of even 20% to vote for the radical right if they are against immigration. The mirror image are the Greens. So the mirror image of the radical right are the Greens on the left, which confirms the idea that the new parties which are involved with the new cultural issues are benefiting from progressive and, let's say, nationalist positions on the one hand and on the other hand. Note, which is also important, the radical right hardly benefits on the cultural gay rights issue. The effects are very weak, independently of which camp you identify with, and the same applies with regard to the economic issue. So the radical right is really a party family that benefits from the new cultural issues and has relatively little to do with traditional cultural liberalism or cultural conservatism. Now, let me summarize and conclude. The strategic approach is least supported because we didn't find direct effects of issue-specific mobilization during the campaign on the vote choice. But as I said, I mean, we didn't give the approach as much chance as we gave to the other approaches because we don't have individual salience measures. And we don't have these measures because the data sets where you have positional measures and salience measures at the individual level at the same time are extremely rare. And especially we needed to have data sets which we could combine with our national election COSA data. And that's why we came down with these ESS, and ESS does not have salience measures at the individual level. Now, the group identity approach, we confirmed the important role of partisan identity, especially for mainstream parties, if properly defined. So we defined it as a bloc identity, and in Europe, I think this is the way to go. The structural approach is also confirmed by the importance of partisan identity, but it is also confirmed by issue-specific positions. They matter according to the reinforcement hypothesis, above all on the right. Issue-specific mobilization during electoral campaigns reinforces the effect of issue-specific positions on the vote, and they matter as issue-specific votings. The effects are in line with the specific issue voting hypothesis, which specified that specific issues will have effects on specific parties. But the effects are not necessarily greater for challenger parties, although we found the strongest effects for the radical right. The effects of for the liberals in terms of the neoliberal economic voting were pretty strong too. Now, these kind of results reveal the dynamics of the party systems, especially building on the evidence provided in favor of the structural approach. And I want just briefly to illustrate this point by the Social Democrats. The Social Democrats, among the left-wing voters, we have seen it, they suffer from a double competition from the left on both economic and cultural issues. On economic issues, they suffer from the radical left. On cultural issues, they suffer from both challenges, but on new cultural issues, especially from the Greens. But they not only suffer from double competition from the left, they also suffer from double competition from the right on cultural issues. Among conservatives, they suffer from the competition on traditional conservatism by the conservatives, Christian Democrats, and on the new cultural issues, they suffer from the radical right because those on the left who are against immigration have a certain probability to vote for the radical right. As a result, on cultural issues, unexpectedly, they benefit from conservative left-wing voters and liberal right-wing voters. And on economic issues, they benefit from progressive, non-aligned or right-wing voters, but not from left-wing voters. Now, given this configuration, what should the Social Democrats do? I mean, I raised this question for a discussion, but this is certainly a question Social Democratic campaigners and party officials are asking themselves. They are in a very difficult situation. Now, finally, let me conclude with pointing out some limits of this analysis. In this analysis, we have treated Europe as a whole. That is, we have not differentiated by regions or countries, although we know that the new cultural conflicts are much more important in Northwestern Europe than in Southern Europe or in Central and Eastern Europe. And probably if we differentiate by region, we find even stronger results. We have no over-time analysis. So we treated the period 2002 to 2018 as one undifferentiated situation. and we could analyze the development over time and the different differences by cohorts. And finally, at the individual level, we have not differentiated according to political awareness or political interest. Of course, we know since Zaller that these variables are very important moderators of all the effects I have presented here. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. So now we have about 40 minutes for our Q&A part. And so please, I see a raised hand from Edward, and then from Lytkina Ekaterina. Edward?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Maybe this is another clarification question. I probably missed something. It appears that you do not have a salience measure on the individual level.
Right, right.
So you don't know whether voters think this or that particular issue was salient or not. And then how could you, develop a valid measure for strategic approach?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a fair question. We assume that the mobilization of the party in the electoral campaign has a direct effect on the vote of the voters. So the more a party, let's say, take the radical right mobilizes on immigration, the more salient immigration is in its campaign, electoral campaign, the more it should get votes in general. It should not get just votes among those who think this is an important issue. It should just generally get more votes. That is, I think, what the strategic approach claims. Of course, it would be better if you could show that it gets more votes among those who consider this is a salient issue. But it is also, this approach also, I think, would expect, because this approach says political entrepreneurs choose certain issues which are unoccupied by other parties. So political entrepreneurs from the right choose immigration, and they mobilize on immigration, and they render this issue more salient. So you would expect that the more salient an issue like immigration is in the electoral campaign, the more the party who owns this issue will get votes, independently of the mediating effect at the individual level. It would be better if we could show the mediating effect, but we can't because we don't have the variable. Now, this book has come out last year, the book by Katrin de Vries and Sarah Hobble. And what kind of data do they use? They use European election studies, because in European elections, they ask for the most important issue. So you know what people perceive as the most important issues. But on the other hand, at the European election study level, you have only on the supply side the mobilization in European elections. And European elections are very unimportant elections, so the parties mobilize relatively little, and what they mobilize is not so important. National elections are much more important. So we figured that the supply side operationalized in national elections should have a much bigger effect than the supply side mobilized in European elections. And we don't find this effect. But that's certainly a weakness of the paper and of the presentation, that we don't have a measure for salience at the individual level.
Thank you. Well, this clarifies it. And something that is an aside comment, not directly related to your presentation, but nevertheless, you did say the revolution of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s,
Yes.
the Cultural Revolution. And when we look around at what's going on right now, there is definitely another. So this seems to be a permanent revolution, just like Mr. Trotsky, who was in opposition to Mr. Stalin, suggested that once you start, you never stop. I just wondered.
You remember, I had earlier talks at your lab, and for me, it is very important that there were these two waves of mobilization in the aftermath of the 60s. First was the silent revolution of Ron. And that gave rise to the radical left, new radical left, and to the Greens. And then there was the second wave, which was in the sign of the radical right. And the second wave was not about cultural liberalism, and it was not a cultural backlash against cultural liberalism. It was in the sign of nationalism and cosmopolitanism. And I presented once this paper about conservatism, which was rejected by reviewers because I had not enough items for gay rights. But there I distinguish between two types of conservatism: the traditional conservatism, which opposes cultural liberalism, and the new kind of conservatism, which is nationalism, which opposes multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism. And now you see in my results, which do not distinguish between European regions and which are probably mainly affected or strongly affected by Northwestern European countries, but you see that the radical right benefits only from nationalism and not from gay rights. So the party that benefits most from gay rights, that is from a traditional conservative position, is the mainstream conservatives, Christian Democrats. So it would be a mistake to think that the new radical right is a backlash against cultural liberalism. It is not. And just to illustrate this, in Holland, you had Pim Fortuyn, who was the founder of the radical right in the Netherlands, the first. And he was killed in the electoral campaign and was replaced by Wilders. But Pim Fortuyn, he said, I have not all my life, he was a gay, all my life fought against Catholic priests in order to now accept some ideas of some imam. So he was against Islam, but he was against Islam because he was a gay and could not accept the Islamic injunctions against the gays. And Marine Le Pen, she is not a culturally conservative person. She accepts gays in her own rank. So the voters for Rassemblement National, as it is called now, they do not particularly oppose gay rights. They oppose everything that is not French, that is Islamic, or that is foreign in any sense. So I think this is a very important point, which nicely comes out in the results, and I feel comforted by these results, that actually the traditional cultural conflict, in the name of religion, if you want, between conservatives and liberals, culturally liberals, is a conflict that opposes on the right the conservatives and the liberals, two mainstream parties, as it has since the 19th century.
Oh, thank you for this perspective.
Thank you. Екатерина Лыткина.
Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. So basically, I have one short clarification question and 2 points. So 2 questions. So the clarification question is about how you personalized the left behind.
Yes, that's easy. I mean, we didn't, it's just a control variable here. It doesn't matter for us. But in the ESS, there is a question. How difficult it is for you, it's at the very end of the questionnaire, how difficult it, after the social demographic questions, how difficult is it for you to cope with the economic situation? It's very hard to come to terms with economically, or we have an easy life economically. I don't know remember the exact categories, but it is the subjectively perceived difficulty in coping economically.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then my first question is basically that I found it very interesting. I mean, it's really lovely that you reestablished, so to say. I mean, in psychology, everyone is saying, oh, the left and the right dimension doesn't work at all. This is maybe the most often thing that you would hear in political psychology, at least at our place. And it's very nice that you reestablished, so to say, gave legitimacy to it. I'm just thinking that the voter in your terms is a bit rational choice voter. So it's a person who is very rational, who knows the programs, who is voting, who is aware. Of course, you said in your limitations that you account for basically, you cannot account for interest and awareness, but maybe it's also voting, if people are voting or not voting, or that could give something. And also there are some things like, for example, the political crisis within the parties. For example, in Germany, there were like different crises of social democrats. And that led to changes of them losing votes, for example. Or some splits, for example, between the youth social democrats and the core. So basically such things could affect the voting and process voting, of course, because I might be like to claim that I protest from against some parties, established parties, and so on. So this is the first question, and maybe the second question would be, of course, it would be so great if you could extend on time perspective. Maybe you gain some salience of the context. So like economic crisis of 2008, or for example, migration crisis. Of course, it's difficult to state causality, but on the other hand, it gives some glimpse maybe in this direction and helps you in this way. And of course, it would be also maybe great to get the geographical issues or countries in terms of course, the economic issues are more salient on the south, and the cultural issues like in the north. So that would be interesting.
Yes, you are absolutely right in everything you say. First, your first question is actually a set of questions, and the first point you mentioned, that in your political psychology, everybody thinks left and right is no longer important. You should not throw out the baby with the bathwater, but it is true. I mean, I didn't say how many people identify with the left, how many with the right, and how many are non-aligned. Across Europe, it's a third, a third, a third. So a third are non-aligned. The non-aligned group is very big comparatively. And it makes a big difference whether you get, like the radical right, you get the non-aligned vote on immigration issues, because it's a third of the population, of the voters. That's another point you make, which is very important. A lot of party competition is about mobilizing voters and getting them to the voting booth. So what I only analyze, so that's another limit of this study, we only analyze voters. So we don't analyze who is voting and who is not voting, or who is voting no longer. We don't analyze that some parties systematically lose voters over time. Like the Social Democrats, they went down from 35% in 2002 to 25% in 2018 across Europe. So that we don't analyze. You cannot do everything in the same paper, because voting is an extremely complicated matter. Now, you are right, and I think this is a very good point of yours, that our voter is a rational choice voter or a rational voter. The voter takes issues seriously. I mean, it's not just a rational voter, or it is a combination. The voter has an identity, and he votes according to his identity. Let's say the people who have a left identity have a more than 50% chance of voting for the Social Democrats and a pretty high chance of voting for the radical left. And what is left is filled in by issue voting. So to some extent, it's pure loyalty, but to some extent, and this is the point we stress, so there are no emotions. Emotions are dear to you. In our case, no emotions, because political scientists have traditionally ignored emotions, and all these big data sets don't have any information on emotions. Emotions might be important. We have emotions to the extent that you have loyalty to certain parties. We call it now loyalty to a block of parties. But you're right, it's a relatively brain-centered type of voter. But you see in the results that issues matter and issue positions matter. And I have reacted strongly against this idea that it is only salience. No, voters are not stupid. As in a very important quote, V.O. Key in the 1960s said that voters are, you make a mistake if you think voters are stupid. They use certain heuristics which facilitate their life, but it makes a difference whether your party is in favor of immigration or against immigration. You saw that. I mean, it's secondary to party identities, but it makes a difference. And it would be a mistake to assume that issue positions are completely irrelevant. Actually, what happens is that's also what you find in very many empirical analyses. You cannot change attitudes. Voters have their attitudes, but what you can do, and since Lazarsfeld, 1944, this is received wisdom. You can activate or reinforce the importance of a certain attitude. You can make voters think of income equality and then hope, because you own the issue, that you get the vote of the voter, and that he does not think of immigration, because if he thinks of immigration, he will vote for the radical right. So in that sense, the supply side makes a difference. Political entrepreneurs make a difference, but it makes a difference within the constraints set by the attitudes the people have already. And the attitudes imply certain positions. You are in favor or against immigration. And then your second remark about time perspectives. Actually, you mentioned two dates, which I also, of course, thought about. 2008, the Eurozone crisis starts, financial crisis. 2015, the refugee crisis starts. And we actually tried. We had two ways to operationalize time. One way was a linear trend and an accelerating trend, a squared trend. And the other way was dummies, period dummies before the Eurozone crisis, between the Eurozone and the refugee crisis, and after the refugee crisis. Unfortunately, no effect. And it's puzzling to me why we didn't find any effect, because I saw publications before which found effects for more specific types of voting of the refugee crisis. For example, Abu Chadi and colleagues, they found an effect that they just looked at the vote for the radical right and for the mainstream right. And they found that after the intervention of the refugee crisis, the radical right won voters over from the conservative right to a greater extent than before the refugee crisis. But we could not replicate this. So this is still work in progress. I think you are also right that the distinction between Southern Europe, where economic issues are more important, and Northwestern Europe, where cultural issues are more important, is really relevant, as is the distinction between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, because in Eastern Europe, the volatility is greater and let's say the identities are not yet so well developed.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. So we have a question from Anna Shirakanova.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the lecture. I have an easy one. So you promised to tell us a little bit more about the Bayesian estimation that you applied there and why you went for this. So could you please tell a little bit about the advantages that you achieved with applying this approach?
It's actually not an easy one, because this is Chendi Wang, my co-author, who did this. I'm not into Bayesian statistics. I calculated everything myself on Stata with ME logic. And then comes along Chendi Wang and says, no good. And why is it no good? There is a discussion by a guy called Stegmüller, and he, in 2013, he wrote a paper where he showed that for a limited number, if you have only a limited number of upper level units, the frequentist estimations are biased. And we have, at the upper level, I told you, we have 54 elections, but for some party families like the Greens or like the radical right, we have less than 30 elections, because these parties do not exist in more than 30 elections among the elections we have. I mean, 54 would already be a good number for the upper level, but 30, says Stegmüller, is a low number, and you have to be aware that frequentist estimations lead to biased estimates. That is, the point estimates are the same, but you get smaller confidence intervals than would be justified. And there is now a discussion, if you are interested, in the British Journal of Political Science between Martin Elf and co-authors and Stegmüller. And Martin Elf, he defends the frequentist approach and says that if you do a certain correction, don't ask me how this correction works, but if you do that correction, it is approximately correct to do frequentist solutions, even if you have relatively few cases. But the problem is, I do Stata, and in Stata, this correction is not implemented. It's only implemented for XT mix, that is for linear solutions, not for logic solutions. And Chendi, he is the R champion of Bayesian statistics, so he estimated everything with Bayesian statistics. And I tell you that, just an aside, I have never had this before. I had to, for ME logic in Stata, with 58,000 cases and 54 cases at the upper level, and random effects you need to have random effects. The statistics tell you need a random effect for the attitudes, 3 attitudes. The computer worked for a whole night. So I have a very good laptop, but it takes forever to estimate that stuff.
Thanks for the story. Thanks.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. We also have a comment in the chat from Misha Minkov. So the platform of the radical left certainly depends on country factors. The Bulgarian far right opposes immigration and is very vocal against gay rights, transgenders, and so on.
We don't have Bulgaria, but it's of course true. Party families are heterogeneous affairs. Let's take the liberals. I mean, the liberals are particularly heterogeneous. For example, in the Netherlands, we do have the Netherlands. Now, if you take the last elections, the 2 parties that came out as the winners were the social liberals and the conservative liberals. And it's not clear whether they can form a government together because the social liberals are so different from the conservative liberals on an issue like immigration. So, but we have the social and the conservative liberals in the same party family. And I mean, how you define an individual party is even a problem. Take the Polish PO. The Polish PO by Palgaf, which is the website which is probably the best one for classifying party families, which we have used. But for the Polish PO, this Palgaf dataset says PO and PiS are both conservative parties. If you accept this, you have only conservative parties in Poland. So we did not accept this, and we coded PO as a liberal conservative party to distinguish it from the conservative PiS. But of course, party families are heterogeneous. For example, the Greens in a country like Switzerland, they are split between liberal Greens and green Greens, and radical left is particularly difficult because in Scandinavia you have red-green new left parties, whereas in the rest of Europe they are, for example, in Portugal you have 2 parties. One is the Bloco Esquerda, is a new left-green party, and the other one is the Communist Party, traditional Communist Party, democratic socialism, which is conventionally mobilizing on economic issues and less so on cultural issues. So what I presented to you is a radical simplification of many more details. The question is how you simplify. For example, we just said we don't look at regional parties. Regional parties are extremely important in a case like Spain. That's the main conflict in Spain currently. But we cannot have this Spanish specialty in an analysis which is across Europe. And you could say agrarian parties are very important in Scandinavia, but we do not look at agrarian parties because they are just important in Scandinavia and we don't have enough cases. Finally, Cinque Stelle in Italy. It's the most important party in Italy currently. We excluded it from the analysis because we could not situate it in party family terms. It's highly contested. I would have situated them on the radical left, but colleagues say no way. So.
I also have some questions.
Yes, please.
Well, when I monitor like term papers and diplomas of Russian politicized students, I see that they are less and less interested in electoral behavior research. However, I see more and more interest to digital political participation. So, and this is the question about media and salience. So can you say a few words more how those media sources which you used for salience measurement were selected. So as I understand, you have preferred newspapers, and I would say that in 2002, definitely it would be the smartest choice. But in more recent periods, we know from surveys that people consume more and more information from social media. And so how can we adjust it to that? Moreover, if we go further, we see that the effect of echo chamber appears when people, they prefer consuming political content, political media content from a very similar sources, and they just distrust to alternative sources. Like we know that in the US context, Democrats, they distrust, let's say, Fox News, and Republicans, they distrust CNN, and so on and so forth. And finally, so just a bit speculative, so there is a techno-pessimistic approach to this, where like big high-tech companies who abuse the benefits of such technologies as big data, neural networks, artificial intelligence, and come up with almost perfect algorithms which produce, customer-specific content that targets, individuals with their specific social psychological profile, like where voters and individuals almost lose their freedom of will and become manipulated by some external political actors. So what is your stand on that, and how may it affect your theoretical and empirical framework?
Yes, my position on that is pretty clear. Much ado about nothing. I mean, but let's go step by step. First, you said your students are more interested in digital political participation than in elections. It's no wonder in your country elections are not consequential. I mean, it depends on the importance of elections. And in the final analysis, you see, let's take Cinque Stelle. Cinque Stelle is originally a movement in the streets. They manifested in the streets, but they became a party. Why did they become a party? Because these people are not stupid. They realize that if you want to change something, you have to win the elections. I mean, they were stupid enough not to use the election victory for something else than reduce the number of seats in the parliament. The really important issues they did not tackle, but they could have, because they have 35% of the vote. That's number one. Number two, echo chambers. That's nothing new under the sun. We had, when I grew up in Switzerland, I grew up in a place with 3,500 inhabitants. There were two newspapers. One was Catholic, one was Protestant. And you read, I was from a Protestant family. We read the Protestant newspapers and made fun of the Catholics who read that shit. So, I mean, partisan press has been gigantic in Europe. And even I have a student. She's Dutch. She just finished her thesis. Her main argument in the thesis, and the thesis is experiment-based. That's also something which is a new trend. The data I showed you are so-called observational data. They are survey data. I'm old-fashioned because I still believe in survey data, because I think it's relevant data, as you do. But there's a big group among the young scholars who think the only thing that counts is experiments. So she did experiments. But what she wanted to show is that all this talk about misinformation and fake news has a bigger effect than fake news itself. And she showed it in experiments. So the worst thing can happen to you is to talk all the time about fake news, because this talk about fake news makes people believe that it's a gigantic phenomenon, although it is not. And all this digital political stuff, who takes note of Twitter? It's all political professionals. It's not the everyday person. The everyday person reads some sensational news stuff like Bild in Germany or the Sun in England. So I think this pessimism about echo chambers and things like that is totally exaggerating a phenomenon that has been there all the time. And motivated reasoning, that is people taking note only of arguments coming from their own camp, that has been around for a long time, which makes Lazarsfeld and his colleagues 1944 say that you cannot persuade people, you can only activate and reinforce existing opinions. So that is the minimal effect of media. And I see now all the time experiments and studies which confirm the minimal effect of media. So and then finally the techno-pessimism approach. That's just an exaggeration of something which doesn't exist. I mean, they of course they have algorithms. Of course they target special groups. Like take me in Fiesole in Italy. I'm looking for an apartment in Fiesole. Suddenly, I also am a big user of the dictionary, Leo dictionary, German, Italian dictionary on the web. And suddenly when I use my dictionary, I get ads for housing in Fiesole. I mean, I was targeted because I was looking for housing in Fiesole, and then I was using my dictionary, and lo and behold, they know that I am interested in housing in Fiesole. That's of course terrible, but in political terms, because of what you said earlier, the echo chambers and the motivated reasoning, it has relatively little effect, because people just don't take note of things which are not in line with their attitudes. That there is not only truth as a motive or a need, there is also safety, security, protection of the attitude you already have. And that second need is extremely important and is often overlooked by those people who are so much afraid of things I think A, have been around forever in politics, and B, are not as widespread today as people think.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. So we have 1 or 2 minutes left, and if we have any last comments or questions, so now it's time to raise your hands or type it in the chat. So I don't see any comments or hands. So that means that I would like to thank our speaker, Hans-Peter. Thank you for a wonderful talk. It was really thought-provoking. And we will reconvene in 15 minutes. So you all had links to another conference. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you a lot. Thanks very much, Andrei.